Hello biology students, and welcome to this video where we're going to be discussing the endocrine and nervous systems. Now, when you think about the endocrine system and the nervous system, really what you can think of is that these two systems are mainly in charge of maintaining homeostasis in the body. Now remember, homeostasis is the idea that living things can maintain a stable internal environment despite the fact that there are external changes happening around them. So these two systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system, have the ability to sense these changes and send signals to the body in order to respond to them and make sure that we stay at stable internal levels. So these two types of systems have different ways of communicating messages across the body, though they both are responsible for communication. The endocrine system mainly communicates chemically via things like hormones. So if there's some sort of change that happens externally and the body needs to respond to that, the endocrine system will send a chemical message, a hormone, to somewhere else in the body to tell it how to respond. The nervous system responds a little bit differently. So the nervous system sends electrical signals throughout the body, and these take place in the form of nerve impulses, which are communication between nerve cells, and we'll talk a little bit later in the video how exactly that works. So let's talk about some of the details here. So in the endocrine system, we're using chemical signals like we discussed on the previous slide. And the way this works is that you'll have some organ called a gland that will sense some change in the body, and then this endocrine gland has the cells that are actually going to release the hormone, release the signal. So here I have my endocrine cell. They sense some change, so they'll produce a hormone, and that hormone will travel through the bloodstream and it will signal a receptor on some target cell somewhere else in the body, telling it to do something in response. So that those hormones will travel through the bloodstream to reach target cells to send their message. Electrical signal is a little bit different. It's just the type of signaling that nerve cells use, and nerve cells communicate between one another using electrical signals. And again, we'll look at how this works a little bit later in the video. So another major difference between chemical and electrical signaling, or endocrine and nervous signaling, is the speed. So you can kind of imagine that nervous cells can send their messages very, very quickly because they're doing so electrically, where it takes time for hormones to be produced and travel through the bloodstream. So endocrine signaling is a little slower. It takes a longer period of time. So here are some examples now. So some example of hormones or chemical signals that might be sent by the endocrine system include things like adrenaline, the fight or flight hormone, human growth hormone, which signals your body when to grow, and then even things like steroids, things like testosterone and estrogen, which are signaling molecules for secondary sex characteristics. Whereas electrical signals are more things that sense changes in the environment, so your smell, taste, touch, sight. Also movement is almost exclusively electrical signaling, and also reflexes, which we'll talk about at the end of the video today. Okay, so let's talk now a little bit in more detail about the two systems. So let's start with endocrine. So the endocrine system, the parts that make it up are basically the glands that are located throughout the body. So all the glands that produce hormones. Now they are all over the place. So you have a lot of glands up in the top half of the body. So things like your thymus gland, your parathyroid gland, your thyroid gland, which are all located here. So you have also some glands located up in the brain region, so things like the hypothalamus, pineal gland, pituitary gland. A lot of your digestive organs release hormones, so they're considered to be part of the endocrine system. So things like the liver, adrenal glands, kidneys, pancreas. And then a lot of sex organs also produce hormones, so things like the ovaries and the females and testes in males. So some important examples are the hypothalamus, which is like the control center of the brain. That's kind of the master regulator. You also have a pituitary gland. This gland produces hormones that tell other glands what hormones to release. Your adrenal gland produces that hormone adrenaline, which is your fight or flight hormone. Your pancreas makes insulin, which we know is a hormone that tells your body to absorb sugar out of your blood. And that the ovary and testes make your secondary sex characteristic hormones, things like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, that kind of thing. Now, the parts of the nervous system are a little bit more broad. So the nervous system includes the brain, right? It also includes the spinal cord and all the nerves in your body. So let's break down these parts of the nervous system just a little bit. So the nervous system can be broken into two main categories. We have what's called the central nervous system, or the CNS, which is made up of just the brain and the spinal cord. It's kind of like the central part of the body, the part in pink, if you look at this picture here. And then the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, is all the nerves that branch off of the spinal cord, okay? And then if we break down the brain even further, there are three main parts of the brain. We have what's called the cerebrum, which is this big yellow part here. The cerebellum, which is this small part down here, and then the brainstem, which is the part that kind of stems off at the bottom of the brain. So the cerebrum, the main portion of the brain, this is where all voluntary, conscious activities are controlled. Things like movement, intelligence, learning, emotions, judgment, anything that you're thinking about and voluntarily choosing to think about and act on, those are all controlled by parts of the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum has many parts. I'm going to point them out to you because I think it's interesting. You do not need to memorize these parts. But the cerebrum itself can also be subdivided into smaller parts. So things like the frontal lobe, the part right here, is mainly in charge of things like reasoning, planning, parts of speech, movement, emotions, problem solving, that kind of thing. Where the parietal lobe, which is kind of on the top here, it's also in charge of moving, but also is things like movement, orientation, so kind of knowing where you are in space, that kind of thing. The occipital lobe, which is towards the back, this is mainly responsible for processing things you see, so visual processing. And then your temporal lobe down here is really thinking about memory, speaking, but then also like comprehending sounds you hear. So it's quite interesting, and there are even further subdivisions within these regions as well. So then going to the next region of the brain is your cerebellum, and this is basically mainly balance and muscle and coordination, right? Coordination to muscle action. If this part of your brain gets damaged, these people often have a hard time staying balanced, like controlling motor movement, that kind of thing. Finally, the last part of the brain is the brainstem, and this is really like the most primitive part of our brain. It's the oldest evolutionarily, and this does all the things you don't think about. Things like controlling breathing, controlling your blood pressure, controlling your heart rate. So all those things that happen naturally in your body without you consciously thinking, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, right? All the things that just kind of happen on their own, they are controlled by the brainstem. So this thing basically keeps us alive. Now, the next part of the central nervous system that is not the brain is the spinal cord. And you can think of the spinal cord as the main communication link between the brain and the rest of the body. So whenever the brain is going to send a signal to the rest of your body, that signal starts in the brain, but then it travels down your spinal cord, which you can really think of as a big bundle of nerves that's inside your spine, inside the vertebrae. And then those signals are then sent out to whatever nerve is appropriate. So you can see this picture over here that different parts of the spinal cord lead to different parts of the nerve, and you can kind of think about it in that the further up on the spinal cord it is, that's linked to a nerve that controls a part of your body that's more high up. Like the top half of the spinal cord would lead to nerves that go to your arms, for example. Okay, so now I've mentioned this word nerves a lot. So a nerve cell, like the biological word for it is a neuron. So a single nerve cell is called a neuron, and this is the basic unit of the nervous system. These are the cells that actually carry electrical signals from one cell to the next. So there are three main types of neurons. There are nerves that sense things, so these are called sensory neurons, right? They might sense a hot temperature, or they might sense pressure, or they might sense a smell, right? These are sensory neurons. They bring information to the brain, or the spinal cord. This is obviously part of your peripheral nervous system, right? It's the nerves on the kind of outside of your body. The second type of nerve is called an interneuron. So these are the neurons that kind of process the information in the central nervous system. So they're the nerves in the spinal cord or in the brain that are going to process that signal. Okay, so we had the sensory neuron receiving the signal, the interneuron integrating and processing the signal, and then the third type of neuron is a motor neuron. So this is the neurons that are going to bring the messages away from the brain and tell the body how to respond. So you might, for example, you might have a sensory neuron sense pressure from a fly walking on your leg, you would integrate and understand that signal with interneurons, and then you would send a signal with a motor neuron to say, hey, flick that fly away, like get it off your leg. And motor neurons are part of the peripheral nervous system again, because they are on the periphery, they're on the outside of the body. So if you put those three things together, we have sensory neurons sensing information, interneurons processing it, and those interneurons could be either in the spinal cord of the brain, and then motor neurons sending a signal out telling the body what to do with that information. So now let's kind of look at the structure of a neuron. So here I have two neurons. There's one neuron, one nerve cell here, and one nerve cell here. The cells have pretty funny shapes. You can see this whole structure here is a single cell. Now, in a neuron, you can see this main part here is the cell body with a nucleus and all the organelles. Now, coming up the cell body are all these little extensions called dendrites. And the dendrites are these little projections that are going to receive signals at the kind of the beginning of the neuron. The signal is then sent down this long structure called the axon, which is written over here. And then at the end of the axon, there's some projections that will release the signal to the next neuron in line. So like the dendrites will receive the signal, it will be sent down the axon, and then the signal will reach this kind of gap called the synapse where it is sent from the end of one neuron to the beginning of the next. Now, the way that signals bridge this gap from the end of one neuron to the next are via these chemical messenger molecules called neurotransmitters. So this slide summarizes all that information I just said. So dendrites bring impulses from the environment or other neurons toward the cell body. The cell body is the part that has all the nucleus and the cytoplasm and any kind of organelles that are located in the neuron. The axon is that long fiber that carries the electrical message away from the cell body. Oh, we didn't mention this one on the previous slide. So the myelin sheath is this fatty substance that surrounds the axon. And you can think of it like the rubber on the outside of a wire. It basically insulates the neuron and allows the signal to be sent faster. Those neurotransmitters were the molecules that passed the message from one neuron to the next. And the synapse was that space between neurons where the neurotransmitters have to travel to bring the signal from one neuron to the next. So again, if we look at how neurons communicate, there'll be some stimulus that will release a neurotransmitter that will be received by the dendrite of one neuron. This neurotransmitter will basically activate ion channels in this nerve, and ions, positively charged ions, will rush into the neuron. And as this happens, these some positive ions rushing in will activate ion channels next to it right here, which will allow more ions to rush in. And these positive ions keep rushing into the cell, and that movement of positive charges, that is electricity, because electricity is just the movement of charged particles. And as those positive ions move throughout the nerve, that is physically the signal being sent. When that signal gets to the end of the nerve, those positive ions will trigger the release of neurotransmitters, which will travel to the next neuron. It will activate the next neuron to open its ion channels and have positive ions move in, and then that signal will continue to be sent along the next neuron. So that idea, that electrical charge, those positive ions flowing down the axon, that is called the nerve impulse, and that's how the message actually physically moves to the ion. So you can, this is sometimes called an action potential. The action potential is that physical movement of the positive ions into the cell. So you can see as those positive ions rush into the cell, it allows the message to move along the length of the neuron until it reaches the end, which will trigger the release of neurotransmitters, which will activate the next neuron in line. So again, when we get to the end of the axon, those neurotransmitters, that chemical message is released, and that allows the activation of the electrical message, those positive ions moving into the cell, to start at the next nerve. Okay. So finally, the last thing I want to hit is reflexes. So reflexes are these quick automatic responses to a stimulus that you don't really have to think about. And you can think of is they're advantageous because they happen really, really quickly. So you get an automatic response. So for example, if you accidentally touched like the burner on the stove, you would want a very quick response. Your reflex would be to pull your hand away as quickly as possible. Now, reflexes work a bit differently because most of the time when you have a stimulus, you get a sensory neuron sensing it, and then you have inner neurons in the brain processing the information, and then they send a signal out via a motor neuron to respond to it. But with reflexes, the signals do not go to the brain. You have a sensory neuron sensing maybe your hot oven, and then that goes directly to inner neurons in the spinal cord only. It doesn't make it all the way to the brain, so it's a shorter pathway. The spinal cord kind of processes that information and sends it out via a motor neuron telling you how to respond. So therefore, you get a much, much quicker response. And then your brain kind of figures out what happens later. So for example, if you get hit in the knee with one of these little hammers at the doctor's office, that is an example of a reflex. So that signal will be processed in your spinal cord, not your brain, so the processing will happen much more quickly, giving you that response of kind of your leg kind of twitching. Okay? So that's it for the nervous and endocrine systems, and I'll see you in the next one.